cardiogenic shock as part of that. Um, Obviously, we'll be talking about the cardiovascular system, an extensive system including the heart for the pump, the blood volume or fluid, and then the container of the blood vessels. I'm told there's approximately 60,000 miles of blood vessels in every human, so you go around all the way around the Earth twice, 2.5 times. Impressive amount. And so we'll talk about the container and the heart as the pump, and then the blood volume as the fluid here as we go through this. But it all comes back down to why do we breathe? It comes back down to metabolism. And if you think back to knowledge about anaerobic metabolism, aerobic metabolism, Krebs cycle, lactic acid, ATP production, all that sort of thing, I'll try to summarize it here real quick. If you think of ATP as energy, a unit of energy, and you think of anaerobic metabolism as the process that occurs all the time, where glucose is broken down and energy is created. So 1 unit of glucose will get you 2 little units of energy, or 2 little ATPs. And that occurs as anaerobic metabolism in the absence of oxygen, and that just continues. Then if we can add oxygen, the end result is somewhere between 34 and 38 total units of ATP, total units of energy. And so you can increase your efficiency by 15, 16, 17 times if we can add oxygen. And the other piece of this to remember is that as you're doing anaerobic metabolism in the absence of oxygen, then you have a lot of lactic acid buildup, which then adds to acidosis and creates problems. So shock is the result where we have inadequate energy production. Shock is a situation where cells are not able to do what cells need to do because they don't have the energy to do it. And that is usually based on the fact that we're only operating on anaerobic metabolism alone. We're unable to add aerobic metabolism to that. And so it's not generating sufficient energy, and it's not generating it efficiently enough. And so we end up with a situation where the cells are short on energy. And this, in the end, is shock. Now, hypoperfusion, which we tend to talk about synonymously with shock, hypoperfusion results from a problem with either the blood volume or the pump or a container problem. And so we'll consistently talk about pump, volume, and container and ways that those 3 components can be impacted to create hypoperfusion. For instance, you could lose blood. You could also lose blood volume either by sweating or vomiting or diarrhea. But when we talk about trauma, PHTLS is mostly concerned with trauma. Our loss of blood volume, actual blood and bleeding, will be the cause of our low volume issues. And there's some other things that can cause this problem with the pump. Cardiogenic shock is related to a pump problem. So cardiac tamponade, cardiac contusion can be related directly to a cardiogenic source of the shock. And then there's the container shock, the dilatation of the blood vessels, have a much increased container size. And so anytime, whether you lose any blood volume or not, just assume you don't lose the blood volume, if we have 6 liters of blood in a 6-liter size container, then the pressure is good. But if for whatever reason that container now goes from 6 liters up to 9, now you have 6 liters of fluid in a 9-liter container and your pressure has gone down. So you're relatively hypovolemic. You haven't lost any blood, but you've gained a bunch of space, and so your pressure is going to have to go down. At any rate, the end result is the cells are not getting enough red blood cells going by, and so there's not enough oxygen being delivered, and hypoperfusion then leads to hypoxia at the cellular level. So this whole thing again relates back to energy production, ATP, and the need for our bodies to be operating under aerobic metabolism in addition to the anaerobic metabolism that continues at all times. But there's other things that go on as we start to have hypoperfusion. The cell membranes themselves don't act right. They don't work like they should anymore. And we have a lot of potassium and lactic acid are released into the blood. Your blood becomes acidotic, your pH drops. And then cellular processes, autodigestion, and cellular normal death and generation of cells speeds up and eventually ends up in organ failure, and organ failure eventually ends up in organism failure. You also have with the leaky cell membranes, you've got sodium and water entering the cell. Your cells start to swell, And ironically, you have a bunch of edema and swelling because the water that should be inside the blood, inside the vascular system, is now outside the vascular system. And this whole concept of shock as a spiral, a cycle, a spiral into death, essentially. So, and then again, with consequences of hypoperfusion, is body heat is lost. So that energy that the cells are using to make energy generates body heat, and then the body heat is lost, and everything starts to work more poorly. Again, in a spiraling situation. And so the lactic acid builds up, the acidosis continues, the body temperature continues to drop because there's not enough heat to keep it warm. Then the blood clotting becomes a problem. And so this whole thing, again, is a spiral. And it's all based on getting oxygen to cells so that cells can work right and make energy correctly. So we've heard about, heart, lung, and brain need a constant supply of oxygen. They don't do well at all after just a few minutes. In 5 or 6 minutes, heart, lung, and brain are in trouble. Kidneys can last closer to an hour or a little more. And muscles, bone, and skin can do several hours in a low perfusion state or in a hypoxic state before there's permanent damage. And so your body automatically attempts to attend to this problem by shunting blood to the core, away from the periphery, under the theory that heart, lung, and brain need constant delivery of oxygen for those cells to work right. So shock can be thought about as a problem with the pump, a problem with the volume, or a problem with the container. So hypovolemic, a problem with the volume, distributive, or a problem with the container size, or cardiogenic, a problem with the pump. Hypovolemic is the most common cause of shock in the trauma patient. It's mostly due to bleeding. I think if I was going to take a test pretty soon, I remember that. And it's not just the loss of the volume itself, it's the specific loss of the red blood cells that creates the problem, because we can fill that vascular space back up, at least temporarily. We can put enough IV fluid in there to fill the space back up, but obviously the IV fluid is not going to have any red blood cells in it, and so we've still got this inability to deliver oxygen to the cells, and that's the biggest problem. The fact that we've got the blood pressure back up is just nice, but we haven't really fixed the problem. The other key thing to note on this slide is this classification of shock. And now, I'm not sure that this is something where you turn to your partner in the field and you say, oh my patient's in class 3 shock, but it does help you to kind of take a peek at this, particularly on the systolic blood pressure line and on the ventilatory rate line. And so a person with class 1 shock can lose up to 15% of their blood volume and essentially have normal vital signs. Once you go over that 15% range, up to about 30%, you're going to get some tachycardia, mild tachycardia that could be confused with simply being in pain or having fear. Your ventilatory rate's going to go up some into the 20s. Again, that could be misconstrued as a sign of pain or a sign of fear or anxiety or emotional upset. And your blood pressure is going to remain normal. So think of it this way: you can lose a third of your blood volume before you ever really see significant changes in vital signs, in which case you then get tachycardia over 120. And these are in normal patients, normal hearts, and patients not taking anything to keep their heart rate artificially low, like a beta blocker. So this is in the unmedicated, healthy heart. You're going to get tachycardia up over 120 to 130, 140, 150 range. Ventilatory rates exceed 30. And then finally, there's a decrease in blood pressure. So shock is well compensated up until you've lost about a third of your blood volume. Distributive shock is a little bit more difficult concept to get a grasp around and to be totally inclusive here. There's a number of causes of distributive shock: anaphylaxis, sepsis. But in the trauma situation, we're talking about neurogenic shock. So I try to explain this to our incoming EMT students in a very simple way and say that blood vessels are under control of the brain. And blood vessels are like a lot of folks, that if they're not being told to do something, they will relax. And so when the blood vessels are not getting the message from the brain to stay somewhat constricted, they simply relax. So neurogenic shock is based on the problem where the message from the brain to the blood vessels to continue to do some work, the message is disrupted, it doesn't get there, and the blood vessels naturally just relax. When the muscular walls of the blood vessels relax, the container size increases. And so now you have not, even if you haven't lost any blood at all, you now have a much larger container than you did, and so your pressure goes down. You can also have pump problems with cardiogenic shock, whether that is from direct damage to the heart muscle or a valve problem, or whether it's a tamponade or a tension pneumo. Now we think of tension pneumo more as an obstructive shock typically, if that fourth type of shock is talked about. And so yes, tension pneumos do push on the heart, and you do have some reduced ability for the heart to pump. But the tamponade is the other one. And I think we'll show you some cadaver lab autopsy video in class that will really give you an appreciation for how tough that pericardial sac is and help you get a visual for how a tamponade could build up. But basically, there's a leakage outside the heart, inside the pericardial sac, and that produces some pressure on the ventricles, and they're not able to pump out. So shock is a progressive, spiraling condition where a number of things start to work in a cascade of negative events, and we end up with cellular problems, metabolic problems at the cellular level, and then microvascular problems. So small clots develop, and leakage at the capillary level becomes a problem. We can compensate pretty well, but those are only short-term compensation mechanisms. So appropriate perfusion of the body requires the pump to be working, have an intact vascular container, have an adequate amount of blood in that vascular container, and I would also add of the right mix, an adequate volume of real blood, of red blood cells, and then adequate vascular resistance. The container, again, must be appropriately sized and have appropriate resistance. Talk here a little bit about cardiac output, talk about the Starling's law and preload. Cardiac output is the stroke volume times the heart rate. So if the stroke volume were to go down because of a tamponade or a weakness in that ventricular wall, then the heart rate would have to go up in order to keep the cardiac output same. If the heart rate were to go down, then the stroke volume would have to go up in order to keep the cardiac output the same. So stroke volume, if you think about it, is the amount of blood ejected with each contraction, and that depends completely on preload. In the shock patient, the trauma patient, that depends on preload. So if we reduce preload, we reduce the amount of blood coming back because of a tension pneumo or sheer loss of volume, as preload drops, then stroke volume is going to drop. Now this thing about Frank Starling's law, or the Starling mechanism, think of it as a rubber band. If you want to pop somebody with a rubber band, you can just stretch a rubber band before you let it go. And so that's where the atria and the preload come into play here. The atria contract and pump and load up that ventricle. And if there's adequate preload, then the ventricle not only fills, but it stretches a little bit. And that's the Starling law, Starling mechanism. And so we need that good preload. We need that ventricle to stretch a little bit, and in order to have an effective cardiac output. So cardiac output is just one factor in maintaining the blood pressure. The rest of it comes from the systemic vascular resistance, or the vasoconstriction, the amount of vasoconstriction or dilation in the container peripherally. And so if cardiac output is going to drop because preload has dropped or the pump is not functioning as well, then systemic vascular resistance is going to have to increase in order to keep that blood pressure up. And so that's the compensation mechanism. You get a vasoconstriction as an attempt to compensate for that drop in cardiac output. The cardiac output typically in shock, in trauma-related shock, is related to a blood volume loss. And so this vasoconstriction can, to some extent, compensate at least for a while. However, vasoconstriction then means that there's reduced blood flow to the periphery. So now you have the vicious cycle starting up again, where you have vasoconstriction in order to keep the central blood pressure up to heart, lung, brain, and kidneys. But now you've got a decreased amount of blood flow because of this vasoconstriction. The brain is extremely sensitive to hypoxia, to low blood flow, and it can only function at like 4 to 6 minutes without a big problem. Altered level of consciousness occurs early, and that's an anxiety, a restlessness. Again, also easy to confuse, easy to misconstrue, easy to miss in your assessment. Sure, altered mental status is the first sign of shock. It's also the hardest one to notice, and some of these folks have an altered mental status to start with or from other causes besides shock before they end up in trauma. The organs can last a little bit longer. The skin can last much longer, as we said, but this vasoconstriction is for compensation to keep blood pressure up. It's not good for the tissues as a whole, as seen here with some of the microvascular changes. So what goes on is there's a sphincter on the front end of the capillary and then on the back end, so pre and post capillary sphincters. And initially they both constrict, but then as time goes on, the precapillary sphincters, the ones on the inbound side, will relax, but the ones on the outbound side, the postcapillary, remain constricted. So now you've got blood flowing in, but it can't flow out. Then eventually, the downstream ones, the postcapillary sphincters, relax, and now you've got all the little blood clots that had formed and all the acidotic blood returning. And so you can see how the vicious cycle just continues, and it's no wonder that shock is the killer that it is.